A new bill is stirring debate on Capitol Hill, the GRACE Act, designed to guarantee religious accommodation in childhood education. Supporters call it a victory for parental rights. Critics fear it blurs church-state lines. What's really at stake? Students, schools, and families? Stick around and hear today's discussion with our panelists. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Dr. Wilmer Leon, nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to the national and international television news programs and newspapers. We also have Judith Hawkins, who's a former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. We have with us also Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine, and we have Mr. Stephen Allred, who is the director of government relations for the Church State Council. Ladies and gentlemen, good to have you here and looking forward to our show today. Guaranteeing religious accommodations in childhood education. They call that the GRACE Act. This bill prohibits federal education funding to educational institutions and agencies that refuse to provide students with a religious exemption for vaccine mandates. Freedom of speech and religion is what's considered to be the most sacred right guaranteed under the Constitution. And some believers believe that no student or their family should ever be coerced into sacrificing their faith or jumping through loopholes to comply with vaccine requirement. You know, Steve, when I take a look at this GRACE Act and what it's supposed to be doing from an educational perspective, I'm wondering, is it really something that's necessary, or is it something that's going a little bit overboard, or could it be handled in a less intrusive way?
Well, Orland, thanks for having me again. And that's a good question. This is a very complex, I think, topic, and obviously a lot of emotion on all sides of this debate. I think, as a general principle, people of faith ought to have the right to be accommodated for the practice of their faith. But the caveat, or the kind of the other side of that coin, is if your faith is going to harm society at large, where does that accommodation, where should it end, right? And what I find sad is that as a society, we're at a place where many Christians who once led the way as Christians with caring for public health now seem to only care about individual freedom instead of what is best for the whole society. I think that vaccines are a way to love our neighbor. Now, I know some people disagree with me. They think that vaccines are a nefarious thing that are being introduced to, kill people off or something like that. But I've heard some doctors argue that vaccines really are a victim of their own success. We've come to a place in society where we don't have the polio and the smallpox and some of these diseases that, killed and disabled people within the lifetime of many of our viewers, by the way. And so we're at a place now where we've forgotten that history, and I think we're going to have to repeat it before our society is going to get back to a place where we realize, maybe these are good things and these will help. And so I think, when we talk about Christians, to me, it's concerning when Christians are leading the charge and becoming known as people who care more about individual freedom than the collective good. And I don't think it does our reputation or God's any good.
I'm baffled by this because one of the state's most important functions is to provide for the well-being, the health and well-being of its citizens. And we're talking about proven vaccines that have over time shown the impact and the value. We're talking about you're not taking the vaccine could make me sick. I think I really don't have anything to add to this. These vaccines are not experimental vaccines. They're historically proven vaccines. They are effective vaccines. The health of the community has been greatly secured and improved because of it. And I'm baffled with this one. I'm just baffled with it.
When I read Representative Stubbe's language, there appears to me to be an assumption that there exists some absolute right in the First Amendment to religious freedom. And one of the things that Justice Holmes told us in the Schneck case was that the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect falsely shouting fire in a theater. So the comparison I draw here is just the point. What Holmes is saying is, even with the First Amendment, there is no absolute right. And the very simple, real application of this is when we look at the measles outbreak in the Mennonite community in Texas over the summer. And now we have over, I think, as of in May, over 300 confirmed cases of a disease that had been eradicated in the United States. So I'll take the compelling state interest argument every single day. And now we even see what's going on in Texas with the Surgeon General in Texas saying, who am I to tell you what to put in your body as the Surgeon General of Florida? Well, public health tells you you have the right to tell us that. So I agree 1,000%.
Bettina, I guess the real question is this piece of legislation really needed? It seems as though somehow it's supposed to be protecting religious freedom, but when I kind of take a look at it, it almost seems like there's covering these points in 100 other areas from a local or maybe even federal standpoint. Or is this kind of more grandstanding to really, just get yourself known and see your name stamped on some piece of legislation?
So, Orlin, you have put your finger right on it. This is political theater. It's not making public policy. It only has 15 co-sponsors. It has no bipartisan support. It's got an uphill climb in committee, let alone reaching the floor in both chambers. So this is political theater. It is signaling to a very specific constituency, and it is more about votes than it is about public policy. Having said that, I'm a little torn on this one. I agree with what everyone has said thus far, but I don't want to lose the fact that there are some instances where people have had genuine religious conscience objections to vaccines. And let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Let's acknowledge that there is a First Amendment right to at least put forward a religious freedom claim on this issue. The problem is this, that religious exemptions and claims for religious exemptions, they only operate around the margins. And so when you get claims for religious exemptions in such volume as we've seen since the COVID era, you basically have exemptions, claims of exemptions that are basically negating public policy. And when you get to that point, religious exemptions no longer work. You are creating an environment where raising a religious claim on a specific issue is going to raise skepticism in courts, in legislatures, in the general public. And you devalue the very concept of this sacred religious freedom, free exercise right that is right there in our Constitution. That's what I'm concerned about here. And I'm concerned that legislation such as this is just feeding into culture war narratives in a way that is utterly unproductive. There is room for a reasonable adult discussion about this issue, the legal issues, the public health issues. This bill is not the vehicle for that.
Also, Orlin, one of the other things when you look at compelling state interest and some of the other standards, the court also asks, is there another lesser intrusive option? And so when you look at public health and compare that to the religious right, then the less intrusive option is homeschooling. if you don't want to get vaccinated and adhere to the public standard for health, then keep your kids at home.
Can I ask also a side question? So, who's going to pay the damages that my child suffers as a result of being next to an unvaccinated child for a proven vaccination? I'm not talking about, this is not to me a conversation about COVID vaccination. This is about the proven historical, we have done it, it works, and it keeps public health safe.
Well, now I was just going to jump onto what the judge was talking about here, because I think, it's hard to trace some of these things, obviously, and pin the blame, I guess, on who's spreading what. But I think the point is well taken. And if we were to apply this to any other public health thing, let's say like smoking prohibitions or seatbelt mandates, which, you remember 30, 40 years ago, those were a big deal. It was a big civil liberties thing. But if I had some sort of a religious objection to wearing a seatbelt, or to, let's say, smoking is probably a little bit better of an example, and I say, I have to smoke in my workplace, I have to do it every 5 minutes, and, it's just part of my religion. I mean, I know that's ridiculous, right? But the point is that it does become kind of ridiculous at some point because it affects everybody around you. And I think that's where we as Christians have often lost the big picture, I think, recently in the culture war conversations, is that we're focused on us and my rights. And we're not really thinking about loving our neighbor and looking at the bigger, the greater good, which seems to be kind of a dirty word nowadays.
Well, I think part of that also has to do with the fact that the power of and I'll put this in quotes, the religious right, the political power has now seemed to become more important in terms of policy advocacy and promoting conservative norms than actually looking at the public good.
And Bettina, it looks like the punishment here is barring federal funds. So where do you get everybody's attention? Snatch away the money.
Well, yes, but, let's also acknowledge that it is states that have traditionally and constitutionally had the burden of dealing with public health issues. So that in itself is another issue that I think reveals the true intentions of this proposed legislation. I think all in, the bottom line is this, and that is religious freedom and public health. It's not a zero-sum competition here. There is room for both, but not if we're going to put this issue on steroids, fan the flames on social media, make outrageous claims on both sides of the equation. We need to have good faith conversation about this issue. But you know what? I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Well, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but I think what we're looking for is a word that no one likes anymore, is balance. We have to balance the interests of all individuals involved. And unless we can do that, we're going to find ourselves in these type of fights on a regular basis. Coming up, a Colorado law sought to block a Catholic healthcare clinic from providing abortion pill reversal treatment to pregnant women, but was blocked by the district court. We'll take a look at the effects of this decision when we come back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith and Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a case that's called Bella Health and Wellness versus Weiser, a Catholic healthcare clinic in Colorado that offers what many call the life-affirming and dignified healthcare to men, women, and children from all backgrounds and faiths and tradition. And consistent with its religious duty to honor the dignity of human life, Bella's OBGYN practice offers progesterone, a commonly prescribed naturally occurring hormone to pregnant women at a risk of miscarriage. But a Colorado law has made it illegal for religious healthcare clinics like Bella to offer women progesterone for the purpose of treating threatened miscarriages caused by the first abortion pill, which is a treatment commonly known as abortion pill reversal. You know, Bettino, when I take a look at these type of issues, and on one hand, we want the government to be helpful to sustain life, but on the other hand, we also think that there should be a certain level of privacy, and to couch this privacy in the realm of religious beliefs and Catholic organizations' points of view, it seems like the Bella Health case is going to really take us through a maze that I'm not sure we'll even be able to get out on the other side and recognize what these issues are all about.
How right you are, Orlan. I mean, let's just all stipulate that this is a case that really has a potential to inflame opinion, regardless of what side of the abortion debate in America that you stand on. But I think when you are looking at the record here, I think it is clear that this attempt to regulate the use of progesterone by this Catholic clinic, it's not a neutral medical regulation. It has singled out the use of progesterone in this context, while still allowing the same off-label use of this drug for things like miscarriage prevention, fertility support, even gender-affirming care. And so what this law and what the court found is that Colorado was regulating this medical practice on the basis of Bella's religious motivations. So, you know, I think it is clearly here that we see a very straightforward free exercise analysis kicking in. You know, the law is not non-neutral, it's not generally applicable, and so it triggers what we call strict scrutiny. It's a standard of review. The government has to meet that burden of saying that its law is narrowly tailored, it's a compelling state interest. And the court clearly found that the state of Colorado did not meet that standard. And I think it's a pretty clear case of a state government singling out a religious institution for a non-neutral law that targets a very specific religious position on a hotly contested issue in American society today.
You know, this strikes me as a solution looking for a problem, because when I read the background on this, if this were an issue of Colorado striking progesterone as to assist in abortion, it would make more sense to me than Colorado striking it to reverse abortion. So when I was reading this and they start talking about life-affirming, dignified health care to men, women, and children, then this to me just goes along with the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. So I'm trying to figure out why this really falls in the realm or in the line of religious discussion in the first place.
When I read the review, I had to stop and reread it because I want to know what really was going on here, because I keep saying the law is a living thing. And if you understand what's happening in the background, it can at least help you make some sense of what's going on. So I want to know who was mad with whom, why they were mad, and what the point of it is, because in this society right now, the pro-life issue is so strong. Why would anybody be arguing against women having a second chance to change or having a chance to change their mind and undo the first abortion pill? I just don't understand it.
Well, and I think the order of the court and the summary judgment order there kind of, points out some of the things that were going on in the sense that these anti-abortion centers, the Catholic, centers were advertising they could reverse abortions. And the state of Colorado was saying, no, you can't do that. It's a deceptive trade practice to say that you can do that. This doesn't really work, blah, blah, blah. And it seems like there's really no consensus, or the majority medical opinion is that you really can't necessarily guarantee that, but there's no harm necessarily in giving these progesterone treatments nonetheless. And so that's kind of, I think, the way the court went with it. And I think it's one of those things where here you've got a Catholic clinic, and they view their work as ministry. It's a religious thing. And we know the state of Colorado has the legislature has done some things like this in the past. It seems like targeting people of faith, or at least there's some animus that we've seen, of course, with previous types of situations there. And so I think that's where the court came down on it.
Well, Wilmer, as the resident Catholic on our panel today, I couldn't quite tell, was this legislation trying to assist the Catholic Church, or was it working against the Catholic Church? It was a little bit so confusing that when you think about the work that the Catholic organizations do from a ministerial standpoint, whether it's adoption, whether it's, healthcare, I couldn't tell, was this being pressured based on knowing more about Catholicism or not, but I couldn't see who this was helping.
Well, I had the same confusion. And to the judge's question, the first thing I thought about was what brought this to the forefront, maybe in the first place, was a couple had an agreement that they were not going to bring a pregnancy to term. And the woman in the couple decided, after they had reached a decision, that she was going to change her mind. And so that's the only thing I can figure in terms of what brought this to the court in the first place. I don't really understand. Again, if this were in the reverse, I could understand the Catholic Church saying the church is clearly, in terms of life-affirming care, unless the life of the mother is in danger, that we're not going to engage in these procedures. But when you have the facility doing the opposite, and I thought I read, they said they had 16 successful cases of this. I don't know where the evidence is to support that, but that was one of the points that they made, was that we've had 16 cases, instances where this has been successful. Again, I think it's a solution looking for a problem.
Also, I know that as lawyers or policymakers, we want to stick mostly to the narrow area issue, but I got another question. So you are able to reverse the abortion pill. Well, is there any damage done to the fetus that we may, in fact, be increasing the birth of children with birth defects? Somebody tell me more about this, not just this one little piece. And I know we want to rule on this one little narrow issue, but that narrow little issue has a long thread that it's pulling.
Mm-hmm. And Bettina, I think that's the big point here, is that when you want to get political, in particular with a healthcare issue, and you don't get all of the information, it's like bad legislation that's chasing, as Wilmer pointed out, a solution looking for a problem.
Well, I think the Council for Bella Healthcare developed the record pretty clearly that this was not a dangerous medical practice. It did not have known adverse effects on either fetus or mother. So I think from a health perspective, that's was clearly made out. Mm-hmm. I really do think that we need to do what the judge said, which was, let's work out who was mad at whom and what was the animating issue behind this legislation. And it seems to me that it was ideologically driven, and it was very much a pro-choice, as in a pro-abortion position that the state was trying to carve out, and trying to deny a religious institution the ability to practice and do ministry according to its deeply held beliefs. There's 11 states in the US where there is explicit carve-outs for religious healthcare institutions, recognizing that religious conscience is protected, and they operate even in the medical field. These are ideological arguments that are taking place. Let's step back a bit. Let's have conversations that allow a Catholic clinic to operate according to its deep religious convictions, and that allow states to regulate as they wish. There's room for both.
And Steve, I wonder, are we not doing enough from a religious organizational standpoint to letting the political establishments know we don't need your help on this? We've got this under control. And maybe we're not advocating well enough from that point.
Well, it could be, and in this case, of course, I think we might have to go back, to the fact that the state of Colorado does seem, in some cases, the legislature there to be hostile to some religious practice. I think this is an interesting situation to contrast with what we were talking about. I think previously about the vaccine exemption accommodation issue, because here you have a situation where what the clinic was doing was not hurting anyone. That was clearly laid out in the discovery, and yet the state was trying to say you can't do this even so. Well, that's ridiculous, right? At this point, if your religious conviction says I need to do this and it's not harming anyone else, you ought to be able to do that, essentially, right? I think in the vaccine context, though, it's a much more nuanced conversation, because yes, you should have that right to an accommodation there as well, unless again it snowballs and becomes something that makes society a less safe place. So interesting to look at this case, though. Seems like here, the legislature was clearly in the wrong, and the clinic should prevail.
Well, I'm going to let that be the last word. I think what we're really looking at here is, trying to help political leadership to understand that grandstanding or creating laws in which there's not really a problem, all that does is create more confusion. And then the other side decides, well, I've got to one-up it. And now you got two pieces of legislation that doesn't do anyone any good. So hopefully we can find a right balance, take care of the real problems, and leave the things that are settled just to be settled. Hey, Steve, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Arlen, have you ever said, I'll be back in just a moment? We've all done that, right? Well, I just learned that a moment is technically 90 seconds long. So keep that in mind the next time you say that.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, so this is probably the least useful piece of information you'll hear today, but did you know, Orlin, that the Pope cannot be an organ donor? Because according to Vatican officials, after a Pope dies, his body actually belongs to the whole church. He has to be buried intact.
Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that back in 1943 or so, a woman with German measles broke quarantine, got an autograph by Jean Turney, and as a result, Jean Turney, the actress, was pregnant, and her child was born with severe disabilities because she contracted German measles while she was pregnant from an unvaccinated person.
Didn't know that. Leon, tell me something I don't know.
Well, did you know that a single bolt of lightning contains enough energy to toast 100,000 slices of bread?
Did not know that.
Now you do.
Keep that in mind. Appreciate our talk today. We've got to do this again sometime soon. And thanks you again for being with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.